Hey educators, my name is Megan Beth, and today we're going to take a look at what planning a Think Aloud for a Read Aloud might look and sound like. Remember, Read Alouds offer a great deal to our students, especially when we're working in small groups with students who require higher levels of scaffolding and support. The ultimate goal of reading is comprehension, and when we demonstrate our thinking to our students when reading, we can really help them begin to figure out what types of thinking they can do when they are reading. Read Alouds offer us chances to model and practice comprehension with our students, build their content area knowledge, and it can help us to develop our students' vocabulary and thinking skills. The first step to planning a read aloud is selecting the text. What's the purpose of the lesson? This matters a great deal when selecting the text, as you want to select a text that will be appropriate for your purpose. When using a text for a read aloud, you can focus on comprehension strategies, inference making, character analysis, author's craft or purpose. There's really so much you can do. But remember, it's best to be specific and laser focused on your lessons so you don't get carried away with the read aloud. Focus on one thing. You can use the text again later if it has multiple purposes that it can fulfill. It's also important to not just think about your lesson, but the specific needs of your students. I want to focus on reading comprehension skills, specifically monitoring comprehension. So I've selected a text that I think will provide many opportunities to practice this skill. The text, Diary of a Worm, written by Doreen Cronin, is a fictional account of a worm's life, as told from the point of view of the diary of the worm. But it contains several pieces of information about worms and their lives. You could say this text is a hybrid between narrative and information. The students who I plan to work with in a small group setting need some additional time to think about the difference between what is real and what is fiction. So this text will be a great way for me to think about my teaching goal, monitoring comprehension, and the specific needs of my students within that goal. I have my focus, monitoring comprehension, and I have my text, Diary of a Worm. So I'm ready to move on to the next step of planning a read aloud. I need to read through the text and think about how much I can read per meeting. Typically, you want to chunk the text into 200 to 250 words. But if you're using a picture book, it's also important to consider the time needed to read the visuals in the story, which can play a major role in monitoring comprehension. So let's take a look and see where to stop. I can see that the story starts in March and ends in August. Stopping at the end of each month is a little too short, so I think I will split the book into thirds. It will take 3 meetings with my students to read this text completely out loud. Now that I know where my stopping points are, I need to look through each section and determine if there are any vocabulary words that I need to explicitly teach. Is there any background knowledge my group of students will need to understand the selections? Where in this text do I want to stop and ask questions? And what questions should I ask when I stop? Remember, we want a more thoughtful exploration of the text. Through this type of exploration, students learn how to argue for or against points raised in the discussion, resolve ambiguities in the text, and draw conclusions or inferences about the text. So the questions we ask need to be beyond identification level questions. We really want to ask questions that will get the kids thinking deeply about the text and what is happening in the text. Let's take a walk through the first section of this text and see what it would look or sound like to plan for a Think Aloud while reading aloud. You definitely want to keep your group of students in mind because who you're working with will make a difference about what things that you're going to call to attention, right? And remember, our overall focus is monitoring comprehension. So we want to think about where our kids might get slowed down and plan for ways to stop and think out loud at that part. As far as vocabulary words, tunnel is definitely something that's going to come up and I'm going to want to stop and think about with my kids. Right, so I'm going to just write some of these down right now to help me remember. Like I'm looking at the visual right here and it's just a picture, right? But it's going to matter a lot for comprehending this page and what's happening. The fact that it says bait, I think I'm going to need to definitely stop there and talk with my kids about what is bait and hopscotch. I think that if there was a visual there for our students, they would probably easily be able to determine hopscotch from the context, but because we're looking up as if we're coming up from the hopscotch area, and we're thinking about a group of students with special needs, we're probably definitely going to have to stop and talk about the word hopscotch. You would continue to do this for each section, but right now we're just going to focus on the first section because that's the first section we're reading with our kids. and that's all we need to plan for today. So I've got some words in mind. So now I need to think about what kind of questions might come up for my kids, or what kind of questions might I want to stop and ask them to encourage them to have a discussion that's going to go beyond just identifying something on the page. Because remember, we don't just want to do identification level questions. We really want to help our kids go deep and think deeply about what's happening in the text. First and foremost, we could have a conversation about, because we're wanting to focus on what is real and what is not real. That's something that my students are struggling with. So I think the diary aspect is going to be very important. Would an earthworm really write a diary? If they wouldn't, why is that something that the author chose to do? So that's going to be a question that I'm going to ask. The one thing you really want to keep in mind is we're planning for a think aloud and reading aloud in front of our kids, and we want to be planned and have these moments where we know we're going to stop to support them, but we want it to come across authentic. So anything I'm writing or doing now, I have to repeat in front of the kids. I'm not going to pull out my pre-written sticky note and say, hey guys, here's the thing, I already planned it. It's going to be authentic in front of them. So anything you do in this planning period is just to help fix in your mind what you're going to do when you're with the kids. So would an earthworm keep a diary? Remember to go deeper with questions. You can say why, tell me more about that, what makes you think that, is there something from your life or your experience that makes you think that? Remember, we're trying to get the kids to talk more, teachers talking less. So I'm just gonna write tell me more on my sticky note to help me remember that. I'm just gonna stick this back in my little planning notebook to come back to. Then as I keep going here, I can see a spider and a worm hanging out. Would worms and spiders really be friends? That's gonna be something my kids are probably gonna wanna talk about. It's also something that can lead to a deeper, authentic research question, because we can actually look up and research, do spiders and worms get along? So we can begin to see the difference between what is fiction and what is real. So are spiders and worms friends? Again, you want to write these so that they'll be fixed in your mind, but it's not going to be something you have stored. You're going to be doing it in front of your small group of students. Oh, this page about the bait, right? It's talking about fishing season started today. We all dug deeper. And there's some images here, right? So why would worms need to dig deeper during fishing season? There's a lot of conversation in that question, and then we can get into that vocabulary word. We can talk about bait. What is it that worms are? Well, they're bait. What is bait? Why would we want to hide and not become bait, right? So there's a lot of conversation there that can help us, not just with monitoring comprehension, but again, once again, thinking about our teaching goal, what's real and what's not real. So that's just a little, we just went through the first section there. We could keep going. Obviously, you want to do this with the whole book. So we want this to be natural in front of our students. Even though we're writing the questions now, we will write them over and over again in front of our students, as if we were asking them for the first time. What we did here is just for planning, to generate possible questions for your students. When you're actually with your students, you might even end up changing some of these in the moment or creating totally new ones, because you're going to be responsive to the needs of your students. This is the way we can plan for thinking aloud while we're reading aloud. Before we go, let's take a look at the read aloud cycle and remind ourselves what we discussed today. The first thing we need to do is select a text. Consider our purpose and our students. We will then chunk that text into sections of 200 to 250 words or less, depending on the needs of our students and the amount of visuals in the book. We want to select vocabulary concepts that we need to specifically teach or talk about, and be aware of those as we're planning our read aloud. Before reading, we will preview the selection and introduce the vocabulary words for the day's chunk to our students. We will then read the section aloud to students, and in this read aloud cycle, it says we won't stop. But since we're working with students in small groups, thinking about their specific needs, we are going to take time to stop and think out loud and ask questions, which is why we made sure to plan for that. Then we will have our students retell the text to us, maybe making an inference, and we will scaffold the use of their vocabulary when we're able to. We really just want to make sure that all of our students have opportunities to use the specific vocabulary words that we have been able to teach them through this read aloud. Then we can reread the text, directing our students to listen for things like the target vocabulary or other things that we discussed. The final step after reading is extending comprehension through deep processing of vocabulary knowledge and text content. We can have the students turn and talk, we can have them write, we can have them create their own endings to the stories. There's so many things, and if you look at your read aloud cycle, you'll be able to think more about that. To recap, select a text. Make sure you consider your teaching purpose and the needs of your students. Chunk the text. Where will you stop? Find vocabulary words. What words do you want to spend some time on? Create questions. Think about questions you could ask your students that would create discussion. Feel free to adjust these questions as you're actually doing the read aloud, but do not go into the read aloud without having any planned questions. Thanks for joining me today as we thought about planning for a read aloud for your small group of students.